Good morning. My name is Mark Susser. I am the historian of the State Department, and I would like to welcome all of you to the department and to this conference on the United States, the Middle East, and the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. This is the second annual historical conference sponsored by the Department of State, and as in our first, and we think successful, conference last year on Guatemala and the 1954 coup, this conference coincides with the release of a new volume of the Department's official documentary series, Foreign Relations of the United States. The volume covers U.S. policy immediately before, during, and after the 1967 war, an event whose legacy is still with us today. The 1991 law that governs the Foreign Relations series requires that it be a thorough, accurate, and reliable documentary record of U.S. foreign policy. And we believe that this is exactly what we provide in the volume that we are releasing today about this watershed event in the history of the modern Middle East. Although the broad outlines of the war are well known, this volume includes many new details not previously available to the general public, and some that were not previously available even to scholars of the period. In accordance with the requirements of the law, this volume provides an accurate and comprehensive account of U.S. involvement in the events surrounding the 1967 war. Our historians have had full access to the files of all the cabinet agencies, departments involved in the foreign policy process during the years of the administration of President Lyndon Johnson, and have selected for publication those key documents that best tell the story of the evolution and development of U.S. foreign policy during this critical period, and of the United States' role in the events surrounding the 1967 war. The volume fulfills the requirements of the law that the published record shall omit no facts that were of major importance in reaching a decision, and that nothing shall be omitted for the purpose of concealing a defective policy. Only a small amount of the material selected for publication in this volume could not be declassified, either for reasons of national security or to protect intelligence sources and methods. We do not believe that the material excised from a few of the 542 documents published in the volume distorts or conceals any facts that are material to the story that this volume has to tell. The publication of foreign relations volumes, such as this one, provides an unrivaled example of a government making its business open to public scrutiny and of transparency. For more than 140 years, the Foreign Relations of the United States series has provided a powerful tool, enabling the American public, and indeed people all over the world, to understand our country's foreign policy process. Today, more than 36 historians and editors in the Office of the Historian work on the preparation and publication of the series. By publishing the key documents themselves, rather than presenting an interpretive analysis, the series is dedicated to objectivity and an absence of what all you journalists in the audience today might call spin. Why do we do this? Because we and Congress believe that in a democracy, it is important for a government to tell its people the truth. We believe it's important that the American people know what their government has done in its dealings with the rest of the world, once sufficient time has passed and the law specifies 30 years after the event, and still classified material has been protected. We recognize the vital importance to democracy of openness and of transparency, but we also acknowledge that a certain tension exists between a government's need for confidentiality and the people's right to know. Secrecy is a necessary condition for the conduct of foreign policy, but we believe that the best way to maintain the delicate balance between secrecy and trust for the citizens and between citizens and their government is to ensure that the actions of government are not hidden forever. And that is why the Department of State publishes the Foreign Relations series. The complete text of this Foreign Relations volume is being placed on the Internet this morning and should be up and available at noon today. The Department's website is www.state.gov. We will also make a few of the printed volumes available for use by the media in the Department's press office. Let me set forth our purpose here today. This is an academic conference, which clearly will be dealing with some controversial issues, many of which still resonate in the current political situation. However, I would like to emphasize that our mandate for this conference is historical, that what we are going to focus on are the events of the 1960s, focus on the facts, and focus on various interpretations of them. But this conference is not a venue nor a vehicle for personal or political agendas or for debate about the current political situation in the Middle East. While our discussion may well provide some useful insights into the origins of current problems, which today's diplomats may be grappling with, our focus is solely on the events of this period. We made extensive efforts to ensure broad participation in this conference, and we are pleased that several scholars from the Middle East, from Egypt, Israel, and Jordan, are here with us today, along with scholars from several other nations. When people ask me what the significance of a foreign relations volume like this is, I reply that the significance is that the United States government is finally providing the complete story of these events to its people and indeed to the world. However, when I am asked about the significance of a particular document, I generally decline to reply, because it really is not our mission to explain the documents related to the events, only to provide them. We'll leave it to the historians, the journalists, and the average reader among the public to draw their own conclusions. This is fully in keeping with the long tradition of objectivity embodied in the Foreign Relations series and the work of the Office of the Historian. I urge you to not necessarily rely on the interpretations and conclusions of others. Rather, read all the documents and draw all your conclusions. In order to formally open this conference, we have with us one of those who is, in fact, grappling with Middle East issues on a daily basis, one of the State Department's most distinguished career diplomats. Ambassador David Satterfield is currently Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. He assumed this position in June 2001. Prior to his current position, he has served in numerous key posts, including Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs at the National Security Council, Director of the Department's Office of Israel and Arab-Israeli Affairs, and most recently as Ambassador to Lebanon. Ambassador Satterfield.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to welcome you to what I'm sure is going to be a very interesting day of discussion of those events of June 1967 and the documents that have been just declassified and released for what I'm sure will be just the beginning of a series of very interesting academic and indeed beyond academic discussion and debate. And I think as the volumes of this extraordinary series continue to be released, covering the period following 1967, more and more the remarks of the speaker on the relevancy of those now almost 4 decades old events will certainly come clear. While you may be bound today by the injunction to confine your discussion to the historical record, to the events of 1967, I fortunately am not so bound, and will be discussing how the events of 67, how that war continues to impact the region, and those challenges which the speaker alluded to that we engaged in the diplomatic business today here in Washington in the Middle East have to reflect upon those events, have to deal with them in our search to try to bring about a peaceful resolution to the Israel-Arab conflict. Although the Six-Day War took place over 35 years ago, its consequences certainly continue to reverberate today. The war defined the shape, literally, of the continuing Middle East conflict and physically changed the face of the region. When the war ended on June 10, 1967, Israel was in control of more than double the amount of land it had controlled the week before, and Israel was in control of a Palestinian population. That fact has been a key element in the Arab-Israeli conflict and efforts to end it ever since. Those of us who work on the Middle East peace process find that we look back daily to the events of 1967. The war's after effects shape our efforts, as in, for example, UN Resolution 242, passed in November 1967 in direct response to the Six-Day War. 242, along with the later UN Resolution 338, has been the basis for every major peace plan put forward over the last 30 years, including the roadmap for peace. Resolution 242 enshrines the broad principles of withdrawal, mutual recognition, the right of all states in the region to live in peace and security. It has been widely recognized, including by the parties themselves, that these principles must be the basis for any lasting final status arrangement and must serve as the guidelines for any successful peace negotiations. They mean that our goal must be the realization of Israel's right to exist in peace within secure and recognized borders, and the right of Palestinians to live in a secure, independent, viable, democratic, and sovereign state of Palestine. The roadmap is an effort to bring the parties to the conflict, Israelis and Palestinians, to a point where they can resolve the situation established by the events of 1967. The roadmap is the implementation of President Bush's vision of two states, Israel and Palestine, living by side in peace and security. That vision offers the hope of a peaceful future to the people of the region. But unfortunately, both hope and a peaceful future too often seem far away to the people of the Middle East. Hope has evaporated in the understandable rage of Israeli suffering through horrible acts of terror. It has been swallowed up in the deep frustrations, daily humiliations, and wounded dignity of Palestinians living under occupation. And what is being lost in all of this is the vision of a different kind of future, of a different kind of existence between these two peoples and indeed between all the peoples of the Middle East. In order for hope to reemerge, to take hold, both Israelis and Palestinians must see the possibility of that different reality from the one that they witness today. Israelis must see an end to terror, the prospect of a final end to the conflict, and full acceptance in the region as neighbors. Palestinians must see their dignity respected, their hope restored for an early negotiated end to the occupation that began in 1967, and the creation of a viable independent state. Such a state cannot and will not be based upon a foundation of terror and violence. On that, there can be no concessions, no flexibility, no turning of blind eyes. Palestinians must be honest with themselves on this point, and will have to confront those among them who would drag the Palestinian people and their dreams further down a dead-end path. A transformed Palestinian leadership is essential to the ability to achieve a Palestinian state. Ending violence, reforming Palestinian political institutions are not a favor to any outsider, not to the United States, not to Israel, not to the international community. They are deeply and fundamentally in the self-interest of Palestinians, and they are the only workable path to statehood and the end to occupation. They are the only workable path forward to realization of the legitimate national aspirations of the Palestinian people. But the emergence of a Palestinian state and the achievement of those aspirations alongside a secure Israel is not just a dream of the Palestinians. Its realization is intimately connected with the future of Israel and Israelis as well, and with the kind of Israel that the current generation of Israeli leaders and citizens will pass on to their children and grandchildren. I must be frank, the demographic picture is very stark. Within the next decade or so, Jews will be a minority in the area encompassing Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, those territories acquired in June 1967. As Israeli settlements expand, those settlements that began immediately after June 10, 1967, and their populations increase, it becomes ever more difficult to see how two peoples can be separated into two states. The fact is that settlements continue to grow today, encouraged by specific ongoing government policies and at enormous expense to Israel's economy. And this persists even as it becomes clearer and clearer that the logic of settlements and the reality of demographics could threaten the future of Israel itself as a Jewish democratic state. For friends of Israel, the conclusion is hard to escape. Settlement activity must stop because it ultimately undermines Israeli as well as Palestinian interests. The course of the separation barrier under construction now remains a significant problem as well, not in its existence per se as a separation barrier between Israel and the territories of the West Bank, but because its planned route inside the West Bank isolates Palestinians from each other and from their land and their livelihoods, prejudices negotiations, and, like settlement activity itself, takes everyone further from the confidence and trust necessary to achieve the President's vision of two states. It is essential that Palestinians understand violence and terror will never be a vehicle for achievement of their aspirations. It is equally important to preserve the possibility, though, that a viable state can be achieved by a Palestinian leadership that is committed to ending terror. That reality, the obligations and responsibilities incumbent upon both sides, and indeed incumbent upon those in the region and the international community, including the United States, who are supportive of this process, underpins our continued commitment, the President's continued personal commitment to his June 24th vision, and to the roadmap advanced by the Quartet as a means of pursuing it. There is important work being done today by others than those involved in government. Non-official channels, such as the grassroots efforts of Sari Nusseibeh and Ami Ayalon, the more detailed proposals of the Geneva Accord and Geneva Initiative, all are reminders not only that dedicated Palestinians and Israelis, people of goodwill, can still negotiate with each other, but also that there is something to negotiate about. These efforts need to be encouraged to foster an atmosphere of hope, to help keep alive the two-state vision, and to help preserve the best and most innovative ideas developed in previous negotiations and discussions. But in the meantime, as that vision of two states still is there in front of us, but not yet achieved, we are left with the hard reality that roadmaps, visions, final status proposals, and plans don't implement themselves. They require hard work and hard choices from everyone. The Palestinian Authority must make difficult decisions, particularly on steps which engage them in changing the security situation on the ground and bringing about an end to terror. Israel also faces painful choices about the kind of country it wants to be. A heated debate is underway among Palestinians, the media, and the public about the choices that Israel will ultimately have to make. And this is a healthy debate. The United States has always sought to support the parties as they make these difficult decisions. We have tried to be an active party and to play a role that addresses the political, security, economic, and humanitarian needs of the region. The political highlights of the peace process are often cited. The 1978 Camp David Accords, the famous handshake on the lawn of the White House on September 13, 1993, for example. But the daily work of building economies, institutions, and meeting human needs all too often receives much less acclaim. The United States alone has provided roughly $180 billion in assistance to the parties in the past 50 years. Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and the Palestinians have been the primary recipients of this assistance, as we have sought and as we continue to seek, to help them overcome the conflict that began in 1967 and meet the financial demands of resolving it. Assistance to the Palestinians is particularly critical today as they labor to establish a working government and to build a society in which peace can flourish, to prepare for statehood. The U.S. has provided approximately $1 billion to Palestinians in the last decade, not including our continued commitment to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. We're not alone in this effort. The international community as a whole has also expended tremendous energy and money over the years to meet humanitarian needs, support regional economies, and create the conditions necessary for a just and lasting peace. As we know all too well, achievement of that peace requires financial support as well as difficult political decisions. And here, as in the political field, the region will not find the United States absent in the days, weeks, months, and years ahead. As we reflect back on the '67 war, as you engage in your discussions today, the impact of those events cannot be ignored. This is not purely an academic discussion divorced from the reality of lives and life in the Middle East, in the region, indeed here in the United States. The task for all of us who have focused upon the issues of the Middle East, for those of us who are working to bring peace to this troubled region, is to create a reality in which an environment in which a new reality based on tolerance, understanding, and peace, a reality very lacking in June 1967, can flourish. 30 years from now, I would like the person in my position, indeed those in your position, to be able to say at a conference like this one that the war of 1967 no longer defines the Middle East. For now, however, it does. And we look forward to the many distinguished panelists and equally distinguished audience members who will be commenting today on the meaning of the events of that dramatic week in June. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Satterfield. We're going to begin with an introduction of the volume, and this is it right here, almost 1,100 pages, by the historian who actually put it together. Dr. Harriet Schwarr spent 26 years in the office of the historian. She has since retired, but she agreed to come back here for a last appearance and explain to you exactly what it was she found. Dr. Schwarr?
I'm just going to give you a few highlights of this volume, which, as Mark says, is almost 1,100 pages, drawn from a much larger, of course, amount of documentation, vastly larger. This is one of what will eventually be 34 volumes of documents on U.S. foreign policy during Lyndon Johnson's presidency, and the second of 3 volumes documenting U.S. policy on Arab-Israeli issues during that time. It begins in mid-May 1967, when Egyptian troops began moving into the Sinai. Egypt's President Nasser requested the withdrawal of UN forces from the border with Israel, and the U.S. government began to move into crisis mode. It concludes with the passage of UN Resolution 242 in November 1967. The major sources of documents were the presidential papers at the Johnson Library and the State Department records, most which are now at the National Archives. Other sources include records of the Defense Department, Central Intelligence Agency, National Security Agency, and Naval Security Group. I tried to include a wide variety of documents reflecting the kind of intelligence that reached Johnson and his advisors, especially before and during the war. Not everything I included was declassified, although almost everything was. A few documents were not declassified, and there were excisions in some others. However, the most important documents were released, and the withheld material would add very little of substance. The focus is on the view from the White House. Johnson and his advisors saw the crisis very much in the context of the Cold War. They learned of the Soviet warning to the Egyptians of an impending Israeli attack on Syria, which according to U.S. information was not true, and they wondered what the Soviets were up to. When Nasser announced that he would close the Gulf of Aqaba to Israeli ships, they wondered if Moscow was behind it. At an NSC meeting on May 24th, Johnson declared he wanted to play every card in the UN to avoid war. But he asked, what if there was a war anyway? Would the U.S. have to intervene on Israel's behalf? If that happened, would the Soviets intervene? In the course of this meeting, the possibility of unconventional weapons in the area was raised. DCI Richard Helms was quite positive in stating there were no nuclear weapons in the area. JCS Chairman General Earl Wheeler expressed skepticism, but acknowledged that Helms had more information on the subject. No one else questioned Helms' statement. There was no further discussion at that time, and this is one of only a handful of references to this subject at all in this volume, although there's a good deal in the preceding volume and succeeding volume. President Johnson wanted to honor President Eisenhower's pledge of U.S. support for Israel's access to the Gulf of Aqaba, which Eisenhower had made in 1957 to get Israel to evacuate the Sinai. But Johnson certainly did not want to get involved in a war in the Middle East. He wrote to Nasser and to Israel's Prime Minister Eshkol, urging both sides to avoid hostilities, and the U.S. and the British tried to get international support to keep the Gulf open with a multi-nation naval force if necessary. When Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban visited Washington and met with the president on May 26, Johnson told him in a carefully formulated statement that was both a promise and a warning, Israel will not be alone unless it chooses to go alone. U.S. officials continued to work on getting support for international action, but with each day that passed, this seemed less likely to succeed. Eshkol warned in a letter to Johnson that there was growing pressure on Israel to take action, and the Israelis sent the head of Mossad, Meir Amit, to Washington to try to clarify the U.S. position. Amit met with Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara on June 1st and warned him that the Israelis could not maintain their high level of mobilization for long, and that their great fear was that a preemptive air attack by Egypt would result in the loss of their air superiority. McNamara neither warned against a first strike nor said anything to encourage one. He asked Amit how many casualties he thought Israel would incur in an attack on the Sinai. Amit said this would depend on who hit first. With air superiority, he thought Israel would only have around 4,000 casualties. McNamara said he would convey Amit's views to the president. It was clear from this that Israel was considering a preemptive strike, but how soon was another question. The next day, Israeli Minister Epi Ivran told Special Assistant to the President Walt Rostow that he thought Israel would take no action before June 11th at the earliest. Meanwhile, word came through Robert Anderson, a Texas businessman and former cabinet member who had long-standing connections with both Johnson and Nasser, that Nasser was interested in sending Egyptian Vice President Zakaria Mohideen to visit the U.S. Washington replied promptly, encouraging a visit and stating that Johnson would meet with Mohideen if he came. The visit was scheduled for June 7th. Anderson's report of his meeting with Nasser did not suggest that Nasser had any interest in compromise, but as of June 4th, Washington officials were busy planning for the visit. Tapes of telephone calls to Johnson from Dean Rusk and Walt Rostow early on June 5th showed Johnson anxious to find out who had started the fighting. The answer to that question was not immediately clear, although it soon was. Unfortunately, these are almost the only tapes of Johnson's telephone conversations relating to Arab-Israeli issues in 1967. There are few tapes on any subject dating from 1967. A third June 5th tape is of a call from McNamara informing the president of an incoming hotline message from Premier Kosygin. Both Johnson and McNamara were obviously taken by surprise by the message, the first use of the hotline for substantive purposes since its creation in 1963. There were a total of 20 hotline messages during the next 6 days. Later on June 5th, Johnson set up the NSC Special Committee, chaired by McGeorge Bundy, as a crisis management committee, perhaps thinking of it as a counterpart to the XCOM of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Harold Saunders' handwritten notes are the only records of the meetings, apart from brief memos of decisions. The notes are fragmentary and often not clear, but they are included in the volume because they shed some light on Johnson and his advisors' reactions to events during the war and their efforts to formulate a policy in the aftermath of the war. Before I get to the treatment of the Liberty incident in the volume, I'd like to touch briefly on the post-war period, where there's a great deal of very interesting material. At the end of the war, the administration was faced with a radically different Middle East. The Arab states demanded Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories before there could be any negotiations, while Israel stated its willingness to withdraw, but only in the context of a genuine peace settlement. In a June 19th statement, Johnson declared continuing U.S. support for the political independence and territorial integrity of all the states in the area. In practical terms, Israeli withdrawal only as part of a full peace settlement. In essence, land for peace. The administration urged the Israelis not to take steps that would tend to make their occupation permanent. For example, it pressed them to allow refugees who had fled from the West Bank into Jordan to return to their homes. When plans for the first Israeli settlements in the West Bank and Golan Heights were announced in September, Washington expressed concern both privately and publicly. In a meeting with Eban on October 24th, Johnson pointedly reminded him of the U.S. position on territorial integrity and boundaries. The Soviets had been pouring new arms into Egypt, however, and pressure was growing to relax the ban on arms sale to both sides that the U.S. had imposed during the war. In the fall, the administration began to permit the shipment of previously agreed upon arms to Israel and moderate Arab states. Egypt had broken relations with the U.S. during the war, and Nasser continued to charge that the Sixth Fleet had participated in Israel's June 5th air attack. This was not true, as Egyptian Foreign Minister Mahmoud Riyad acknowledged in an October 10th meeting with Assistant Secretary Lucius Battle. Nonetheless, Washington took steps to reopen direct contacts with Egypt soon after the war, ignoring several rather dubious indirect approaches from Cairo. Rusk met with Nasser advisor Mahmoud Fawzi at the UN special session in June, and with Foreign Minister Riyad when he came to the UN in the fall. The State Department sent a Foreign Service officer with a good deal of Cairo experience to head the U.S. interest section of the Spanish embassy in Cairo. Robert Anderson visited Cairo again at the end of October. This is, of course, an unofficial contact, and reported to Washington on his meeting with Nasser. The U.S. and Egyptian positions, however, remained far apart. King Hussein was under strong pressure from Nasser to stay with the Arab United Front against negotiations with Israel. However, in mid-July, he sent a message to U.S. officials that he was prepared to conclude some sort of arrangement with Israel. Washington passed this information on to the Israelis, and they indicated willingness to talk to Hussein. Johnson and his advisors agreed that this initiative, which they gave the code name Sandstorm, should be encouraged, but they thought a mediator would be needed. Johnson said he would like to find somebody to work out a settlement. The clock is ticking, he said. There is no question but what the Arabs have no confidence in us. We can't sit and let these things go. He didn't want the U.S. to mediate, however, and it soon developed that the Israelis didn't want a mediator anyway. Washington encouraged Hussein to undertake negotiations, but made it clear that the U.S. role would be limited, and Hussein decided to postpone taking action. There were secret talks between Jordan and Israel in 1968, however, and there is material relating to them in the volume which follows this one. Meanwhile, of course, there were discussions behind the scenes at the UN to formulate a resolution that might provide a basis for a Middle East settlement. In addition to talks with the Israelis, Egyptians, and others at the UN special session in June and July, there were talks with the Soviets. These collapsed when U.S. Representative Arthur Goldberg learned the Soviets had been playing a double game, discussing one text with him and showing a different one to their Arab friends. The effort to formulate a resolution resumed in October. Several weeks of intense negotiations, especially with the Israelis and Jordanians, especially on the U.S. side, especially with the Israelis and Jordanians, culminated in the passage of UN Resolution 242. And this is an enormously complicated and complex story, which I wouldn't even begin to try to summarize, but there is a great deal of material on it in the volume. And now let me backtrack to the Liberty. The U.S. Signals Intelligence ship Liberty was dispatched during the pre-war crisis to the Eastern Mediterranean. I did not find the instructions to the NSA personnel on the ship in the files, but as I noted earlier, it is clear that Soviet intentions were very much on the minds of Johnson and his advisors. The ship was still making its way through the Mediterranean when the war broke out. On the morning of June 8th, fourth day of the war, after messages belatedly modifying its orders had gone astray, it took up its position about 14 miles off the Sinai Peninsula. It was attacked that afternoon by Israeli jet aircraft and torpedo boats with severe damage and many casualties. The NSA cable to the White House of June 22, 1967, which NSA declassified a few months ago and which you may have seen on the NSA website, is in the volume. It states that there were no intercepts of the actual attack. And it includes a transcript, fragmentary and incomplete, of communications between two Israeli helicopters that were sent in the aftermath of the attack to pick up survivors, and between them and those pilots and their air controllers. At first, the air controller told the helicopter pilots the ship was Egyptian. It was some time before they made out GTR-5 on the hull of the ship, and still longer before they confirmed that the ship's flag was American. In my research at the Johnson Library and in CIA, NSA, and Naval Security Group files, I saw preliminary versions of this transcript. Both the substance of the transcripts and the times indicated made it clear that they all reflected the same exchanges between the helicopter pilots and the control tower. I saw no transcripts of the attack itself, or any indication that there had been such transcripts. The focus here, as in the rest of the volume, is on the view, largely is on the view from Washington. The air attack began about 8 a.m. Washington time on June 8th. Walt Rostow reported to Johnson at 9:50 a.m. that the Liberty had been torpedoed by an unknown attacker and that reconnaissance aircraft were out from the Sixth Fleet. In fact, it was not reconnaissance aircraft, but armed A-4s and A-1s that had been sent. The Sixth Fleet and the Soviet fleet were not far apart in the Mediterranean. The Soviets would surely be aware of U.S. jets heading for the war zone. At 10:15 a.m., it's 25 minutes later, Deputy Undersecretary Foy Kohler called the Soviet chargé to inform him that a U.S. ship had been attacked and an aircraft had been sent to investigate. Half an hour later, the report reached Washington that the Israelis had informed the U.S. naval attaché, with abject apologies, quote unquote, that they had erroneously attacked a U.S. ship. The information was quickly passed to the White House, and Kohler promptly passed it on to the Soviet chargé. Johnson sent a similar message to Kosygin via the hotline, suggesting obliquely that he inform Nasser, which he did. In other words, the immediate reaction at the White House was to ensure that the incident did not set off a broader conflict. By the time the NSC, National Security Council Special Committee, met the following evening, news had reached Washington about the details of the attack and the extent of the casualties. Dean Rusk reported that senators on the Foreign Relations Committee were outraged. Veteran Presidential Advisor Clark Clifford called it inconceivable that the attack was an accident. He thought they should handle it as if the Arabs or the Soviets had done it. According to Saunders' notes, the president subscribed to this 100%. Rusk sent a stiff note to the Israeli ambassador the following day, calling the attack an act of military recklessness reflecting wanton disregard for human life. The Israeli reply 2 days later rejected this characterization, and while reiterating regret for the loss of life, pointed out that the Israelis had not been informed of the ship's presence in the area. At the special committee meeting that evening, the mood was, as Saunders put it, sour. Johnson and his advisors agreed that it was a terrible note. And Johnson asked Helms for a special study on the incident, drawing on anything that was available, including NSA material. A CIA memo of June 13th, responding to this request, reported that they had no intercepts of the attacking planes and torpedo boats, but that the helicopter pilots' communications left little doubt that the Israelis had failed to identify the Liberty as a U.S. ship. A follow-up CIA memo on June 21st noted that the Liberty had been identified prior to the attacks, but concluded that the Israelis were not aware at the time of the attack that they were attacking a U.S. ship. It concluded that the attack was not made in malice, but was by mistake, representing gross negligence. The Defense Intelligence Agency reached a similar conclusion, as did Clark Clifford, who made an extensive examination of the intelligence material at Johnson's request. In this short time, I've only been able to scratch the surface of what's in the volume. I can only say, read the unabridged version. And what does it all mean? I'm sure there will be no lack of interpretations, and some of which we will be hearing in the next couple of days. Of course, these are all documents from the U.S. record. One of the things I find particularly exciting about this conference is the opportunity to hear perspectives drawn not only from U.S. records, but from records that are beginning to become available in other archives. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schwartz. We'll now begin our first panel, and we will proceed in the following manner. I will introduce each panelist. Each panelist will then speak for 15 minutes in turn without interruption for questions or comments. Once all speakers and our commentator have completed their remarks, we will then move to discussion and exchange of views among the panelists. This will then be followed by a period of questions from interested members of the audience. I will introduce each panelist briefly. You have in your package more detailed bios. I should also point out that the only material that has been authorized for distribution is in these packages. I understand some other materials are being distributed, and these are not official nor authorized by the department. Our first speaker is Dr. David Robarge. He joined the Central Intelligence Agency in 1989, originally as an analyst of Middle Eastern affairs, and then moved to the CIA history staff in 1996. He has a PhD from Columbia University, and his publications include a biography of Chief Justice John Marshall, which some of you may have read, and a classified history of the CIA under Director McCone, which most of you have probably not had an opportunity to read. Dr. Robarge.
Good morning. The actual title of my talk is Serving at the Pleasure of the President, Richard Helms, Lyndon Johnson, and CIA Analysis During the Six-Day War. And what I hope to do is provide a kind of a leadership personality perspective on the relationship between CIA, the White House, within the context of the analysis of the Six-Day War. Helms, who was the director from 1966 to 73, had the professional misfortune of having to serve under two of the most difficult presidents in American history, Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. And in his recently published memoir, Helms wrote that his own director of intelligence analysis, Russell Jack Smith, described my working relationship with President Johnson as golden, in the sense that it was close to the maximum that any DCI might hope to achieve. However comforting, this assessment is too generous, Helms goes on. It was not my relationship with LBJ that mattered. It was his perception of the value of the data and assessments the CIA provided him that carried the day. And certainly the key intelligence assessment during Helms's tenure under Johnson that carried the day was its strikingly accurate analysis about the Six-Day War. And in this current context of controversy over politicized intelligence assessments relating to Iraqi WMD and seemingly everything else related to that war, this is an interesting case study. One of those rare instances in which unpoliticized intelligence has a specific, clear-cut, and immediate impact on U.S. foreign policy. The CIA was correct about the timing, duration, and outcome of the war. These right answers quickly reached U.S. leaders in an immediately usable form, and the agency did not temper its judgments when faced with policymaker resistance. And so, in sum, the whole six-day war intelligence scenario demonstrates that when the agency advances well-substantiated judgments advocated by a respected DCI with access to the White House, that analysis can prevail over political pressures and the predilections of policymakers. This was especially important for Helms at this time. He needed to impress Lyndon Johnson because Johnson had little experience with intelligence or even interest in it when he suddenly became president in November '63, and his attitudes hadn't changed appreciably in the nearly 4 years preceding the Six-Day War. It's instructive that Johnson selected the hapless William Rayborn to replace the very strong-willed John McCone as DCI in April '65. This clearly indicated where he intended to put CIA in the Washington power structure. And Johnson preferred to hear VIP gossip from J. Edgar Hoover instead of facts and analysis from the CIA. At the time he appointed Helms as DCI in June '66, Johnson was not yet convinced that intelligence could advance his policies, and he was already annoyed at the agency's negativism about Vietnam. And in addition, in early '67, you have a public scandal over CIA political covert action funding, the so-called Ramparts revelations. And so CIA has a public relations problem early in the '67 period, and Helms has to overcome this in some fashion. Of course, Johnson is a very hard sell, a hard mind to penetrate, a difficult man to deal with. Russell Jack Smith has given an interesting vignette of his own frustration about a White House assignment to evaluate the pros and cons of a new U.S. initiative in Vietnam. And it shows the way in which the White House worked and the way in which Helms tried to deal with this relationship. Smith says, if one based a decision on the conclusions of our CIA study, the result was obvious. The gain of the new initiative was not worth the cost. Nevertheless, the President announced the next day that he intended to go ahead with it. I was distinctly annoyed that our admirable piece of analysis, done under forced draft by the White House, was being ignored. So I stomped into Helms's office and said, how in the hell can the President make that decision in the face of our findings? Dick fixed his eye on me with a sulphurous look. How do I know how he made up his mind? How does any president make any decisions? Maybe Linda Bird was in favor of it. Maybe one of his old Texas friends urged him. Maybe it was something he had just read. Don't ask me to explain the workings of a president's mind. Now, the period leading up to the Six-Day War gives Helms an opportunity to act on two of the very important elements of his intelligence credo. And he often expressed these in catchphrases. One of them was, you only work for one president at a time. In other words, Helms well understood that each president has his own appreciation of intelligence, very idiosyncratic one, and his own way of dealing with CIA. And a DCI who does not learn to live with those peculiarities will soon render himself irrelevant. The other catchphrase that's germane here is, stay at the table. A DCI, Helms knew, has to remember that fundamentally CIA is a service organization. Its products must be timely and cogent to be of value to the first consumer. And because Helms was so keenly attuned to Johnson's take on the CIA and also had the agency's analytic apparatus in task force mode in May '67, the agency could immediately respond to White House questions about the looming crisis in the Middle East. On the morning of 23 May, President Johnson summoned Helms from a congressional briefing and tasked him with providing an assessment of the increasingly tense Middle East situation. And here's a chance for CIA to seize the day analytically. Only 4 hours later, just in time for one of the Tuesday lunches, Helms has in hand two papers, one called U.S. Knowledge of Egyptian Alert and the other called Overall Arab and Israeli Military Capabilities. He was down outside Walt Rostow's White House office when these items were delivered to him, along with some other items, sit reps, various other products, all put out by the Director of Intelligence's Arab-Israeli Task Force, which had been spun up for weeks and weeks already putting this stuff out. So there was a lot of on-the-shelf material that could quickly be sliced and diced into these intelligence papers. That second paper I mentioned, which is in the Fruce volume, is the Who Will Win memo. And that's the crucial one. It stated that Israel could, quote, defend successfully against simultaneous Arab attacks on all fronts or hold on any three fronts while mounting successfully a major offensive on the fourth. Now, 2 days later, Tel Aviv muddles this clean intelligence picture by submitting to Washington an estimate that claims the Israeli military was badly outgunned by a Soviet-backed Arab war machine. And I think one insight here may come from something that we may not always appreciate, which is the special intelligence relationship between Israel and Washington conducted by James Angleton on the counterintelligence staff. This is a peculiar situation in which the agency's Near East Operations Division had nothing to do with the Israeli account. It was all handled by Angleton's counterintelligence staff. And this gave, I think, the Israelis a false sense of special entree into high policy-making areas. So they thought here, this late in the day, that they could submit a basically perverse analysis and it would go right to the top, and the White House would listen to it over any other assessments by our own intelligence services. Helms had the Office of National Estimates prepare an appraisal of this Israeli assessment, and it was ready in just 5 hours. The ONE, as it's called, flatly stated that we do not believe the Israeli appreciation is a serious estimate, but probably a gambit intended to influence the U.S. to provide military assistance and make more public commitments to Israel. This is also in the Fruce volume. ONE further concluded that the Soviet aim is still to avoid military involvement and to give the U.S. a black eye among the Arabs by identifying it with Israel. In other words, the Soviets are going to stay out of the conflict and are handling it principally as a diplomatic affair. This is the paper, the ONE rejoinder, about which Dean Rusk said to Helms, if this is a mistake, it's a beaut, and about which the President ordered Helms and JCS Chairman Wheeler to scrub it down, in other words, to create a more formal interagency assessment. Helms returns to Langley and tells the Board of National Estimates to produce such an assessment by the next day. And indeed, it is done that afternoon, military capabilities of Israel and the Arab states. Now, this is the often cited special estimate that appears in a number of descriptions of everything here. It was produced in collaboration with DIA, and this is the one that purportedly called the war right down to how long it would last. Now, a couple of things. It's actually, as you'll see in the volume, not one of the formal SNIEs, Special National Intelligence Estimates. It's basically a typescript memorandum put out very quickly by the BNE in coordination with DIA. And though initial drafts of it said the war wouldn't last more than 7 to 9 days, coordination processes on these estimates being what they are, this kind of fine-tuned judgment usually gets fuzzed a little bit. And so the specificity is sacrificed, and so several days are identified as the time span for Israeli armored forces to breach Egypt's forward lines in the Sinai. Another ONE memo also disputes the idea that Moscow had encouraged Nasser's provocations, and it concluded that the Soviets would not intervene. A senior agency analyst who helped write these papers later remarked, rarely has the intelligence community spoken as clearly, as rapidly, and with such unanimity. Informed by these assessments, Johnson declined to airlift special military supplies to Israel or even to publicly support it during the war. He later recalled bluntly telling Foreign Minister Abba Eban, "All of our intelligence people are unanimous that if Egypt attacks, you will whip the hell out of them." Now, having answered one crucial question to the presidents, how would the war end, Helms is in the unique position of being able to warn the president when it's about to begin. According to several published accounts, Helms met on June 1 with the chief of Mossad, Meir Amit, who hinted that Israel could no longer avoid a decision, that it was holding back because of American pressure, but this had caused it to lose the advantage of surprise. Helms interpreted Amit's remarks as suggesting that Israel was going to attack very soon. Moreover, according to Helms, Amit stated clearly that although Israel expected U.S. diplomatic support and the delivery of weapons already promised, it wouldn't request any further support, and it didn't expect any. Then on June 2, Amit abruptly leaves Washington with the Israeli ambassador. That morning, according to published accounts, Helms wrote an eyes-only letter to President Johnson, one item that was not declassified for inclusion in the Frus volume. This document forewarns that Israel will start a war within a few days. On the morning of 5 June at 3 o'clock in the morning, Helms is awakened by a call from the CIA Operations Center. Our Foreign Broadcast Information Service had picked up reports that Israel had launched its preemptive attack. Soon the Office of Current Intelligence concludes that the Israelis fired first, contrary to their claims. And Johnson is very gratified that because of CIA's analysis and Helms's tip, because of the Amit meeting, that he, Johnson, can inform congressional leadership later on the day of the 5th that he had been anticipating Israel's move all along. During the brief war, Helms meets at the White House every day but one, reporting to the NSC and this special committee that Harriet referred to. He brings with him an outpouring of situation reports. 5 of them a day are put out. DI special memoranda, the PDB, which you still can't see, and other analytic products, both agency-generated and requested. In the midst of one of these meetings, Helms recalls, Johnson suddenly fixed his attention on me, sitting in my usual seat at the end of the long table. "Dick," he snapped, "just how accurate is your intelligence on the progress of the war?" Without having a moment to consider the evidence, I shot from the hip, "It's accurate just as long as the Israelis are winning." Now, this may have sounded as if I were smarting off, but it was the exact truth, and it silenced everyone around the table. Only an amused twitch of Dean Acheson's mustache suggested that he had gleaned my reasoning. On 10 June, as Israeli victory appears near, the White House received a message over the hotline from Premier Kosygin foreseeing a grave catastrophe and threatening to take any necessary actions, including military, if the Israelis do not halt their advance across the Golan. Helms is in the Situation Room with several other presidential advisors when this message comes in. Helms remembered the setting in the sit room as unlike the Hollywood version. There were no flashing lights, no elaborate projections of maps and photographs on a big screen, or even any armed guards standing rigidly at attention by the doorway. The room itself was painted a bleak beige and furnished simply with an oval table and an assortment of comfortable chairs. Helms recalled the hush and chill that fell over the room after the translation of Kosygin's message was checked. He writes, "The room went silent as abruptly as if a radio had been switched off. The conversation was conducted in the lowest voices I have ever heard, and it seemed impossible to believe that only 5 years after the missile confrontation in Cuba, the two superpowers had again squared off." On McNamara's recommendation, endorsed by Helms and all others present, Johnson dispatched the Sixth Fleet to the Eastern Mediterranean, a move intended to convey American resolve without backing the Soviets into a corner. Helms told the president that Russian submarines monitoring the fleet's movement would immediately report that it had changed course. Moscow got the message, and then a ceasefire later in the day restored an uneasy peace to the region.
Excuse me.
Where was the one with the big one?